October 14th, 1943. 27,000 feet above Germany, Captain Don Blakesley gripped the controls of his P-47 Thunderbolt and stared into a sky on fire. Below him, 300 American bombers were being torn apart by German fighters, engines burning, parachutes falling, and there was nothing he could do. His fuel light blinked red. 20 minutes of flight time left. England was 3 hours away. He had to turn back and leave the bombers to die. What he didn't know was that the plane that could save them already existed. It was sitting, ignored, in a hangar in Ohio, a machine that the US military had rejected, and the only reason it would ever see combat was because one mechanic in England broke the law. This is the story of the illegal test flight that won World War II. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a slaughterhouse. Every mission into Germany cost hundreds of American lives. The B-17 Flying Fortress was powerful, but slow, heavy, and vulnerable. Its escort, the P-47 Thunderbolt, was fast and tough, but it couldn't fly far enough. At 250 miles inside Germany, Thunderbolts had to turn back, and the bombers had to go the rest of the way alone. No fighter cover, no protection. Just wave after wave of German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs waiting for them. Every pilot knew the math. 3 hours home, alone. Blakesley's own words echoed through the 8th Air Force headquarters. We need a fighter that can go all the way to Berlin and back. Until we get one, we're sending these bomber boys to die. Commanders demanded a new design. Engineers drafted endless reports. Factories worked night and day. But the answer already existed. Not in a secret base, not in a classified file. It was sitting in a corner of a hangar, written off as a failure. 5 months earlier, in a small Rolls-Royce facility in England, a 30-year-old test pilot named Ronald Harker made a choice that would break every rule in the book. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a fighter pilot. He was a mechanic, an engine specialist, and he was about to commit what his superiors would call gross insubordination. One flight, unauthorized, one report, written without permission, and one idea so dangerous it was technically illegal, but that idea, swapping one engine for another, would turn a rejected aircraft into the deadliest fighter in American history. The P-51 Mustang was about to be reborn. 2 years earlier, a new American fighter had rolled off the production line, the P-51 Mustang. It looked perfect on paper, sleek, fast, efficient. But its engine, the Allison V1710, was a disaster at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison gasped for air. Speed dropped, climb rate collapsed, and in the thin skies where air battles were fought, the Mustang became a sitting target. The U.S. Army Air Forces tested it, shrugged, and stamped the file. Unsuitable for combat. The Mustang was quietly shelved, downgraded to ground attack and reconnaissance. By 1943, it was yesterday's news, a forgotten aircraft parked in a hangar while thousands of pilots died for lack of range. But in Britain, the Royal Air Force had received a handful of Mustangs for low-altitude patrols, and one day a mechanic from Rolls-Royce showed up at an airfield and asked to take one for a spin. His name was Ronald Harker, 30 years old, engine specialist, not a combat pilot, not even part of the RAF command. His job was to test engines, not aircraft. But when he heard pilots complain that the Mustang is brilliant low, useless high, he asked a simple question. Why? That question would change history. Without permission, Harker climbed into the Mustang's cockpit. He wasn't authorized, he wasn't cleared. But he took off anyway, a routine familiarization flight that would become one of the most important in aviation history. At 10,000 feet, smooth. At 15,000, still strong. At 20,000, the power faded. Harker pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang shuddered. He realized instantly. The airframe was magnificent, the handling superb. Everything about the aircraft wanted to fly higher, faster, farther. The only thing holding it back was the engine, and Harker knew engines better than anyone. He also knew a secret. Britain already had the perfect replacement. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the beating heart of the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber, could breathe where the Allison choked. At 25,000 feet, it still produced over 1,400 horsepower, nearly 50% more than the Allison. As Harker descended back to the airfield, one thought filled his mind. What if we marry this airframe to that engine? It was heresy, it was unauthorized, it was illegal, but that single question, scribbled into a report no one had asked him to write, would transform the rejected Mustang into the fighter that won the war, and all it took was one man who refused to follow orders. When Ronald Harker landed that day, he knew what he had to do, and how dangerous it was. He went back to his office at Rolls-Royce and began to write a report he was not authorized to write. He had no clearance to evaluate foreign aircraft, no permission to recommend modifications to Allied designs, no authority to challenge the findings of the U.S. Army Air Forces. And yet, he did it anyway. His memo began simply, "The Mustang airframe is superior to any fighter currently in production. Its only weakness is its engine." Then came the line that would change aviation forever. "Install the Rolls-Royce Merlin." It was a direct contradiction of official American evaluations, a challenge to every bureaucratic decision made for 2 years, and it came from a man who, by every rule, was supposed to stay silent. When Harker signed his name and handed in that report, he wasn't just risking his job, he was defying an entire system. The report went up the chain of command, first to Rolls-Royce management, then to the Royal Air Force, and finally to a man named Air Vice Marshal Wilfred Freeman, the head of aircraft production for Britain. Freeman read the memo once, then twice. He understood exactly what Harker was suggesting, and what it could mean if he was right. Freeman forwarded the document with a note that read, "This may be the most important recommendation to cross my desk this year." He ordered the test to go forward, quietly, without informing the Americans. Because officially, this project did not exist. It would be the most illegal modification in World War II aviation, a British experiment on an American aircraft, done without permission, hidden from the bureaucracy that had already declared it worthless. In a quiet hangar at Hucknall, England, Rolls-Royce engineers began work on Mustang serial number AL975, one of the first Mustangs delivered under Lend-Lease. They stripped the Allison engine from its mount. They brought in a new one, the Merlin 61, fresh from the production line. The mechanics worked nights, cutting, welding, reshaping the cowling to make it fit. No blueprints, no official support. Just a handful of engineers who believed the numbers, and a test pilot willing to break the rules. It took 4 months, 4 months of secrecy, 4 months of sleepless nights, and 4 months of risking careers for an idea no one was supposed to try. Then, on October 13, 1943, the world's first Merlin-powered Mustang rolled out onto the runway. The sun was just rising over the English countryside. The propeller began to spin. The roar of the Merlin filled the air. Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit, the same man who had broken the rules to make it happen, and pushed the throttle forward. As the Mustang lifted into the sky, the men below held their breath, because in that moment they weren't just watching a test flight, they were watching history take off. October 13th, 1943, Hucknall Airfield, England. A thin mist rolled over the runway as mechanics tightened the last bolts on the new engine mount. The aircraft stood silent, its olive green paint faded, its nose reshaped to fit a British heart. It was still, officially, an American fighter, but what sat on that runway was something entirely new, a fusion of two nations, two technologies, and one man's defiance. When the Merlin roared awake for the first time, the ground shook. The mechanics covered their ears and smiled. Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit, fastened his straps, and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang began to roll, faster, louder, stronger. At 120 miles per hour, it lifted off. And in that moment, aviation changed forever. Harker climbed to 10,000 feet, smooth and stable. 15,000, the same. Then 20,000, where the old Allison engine had always failed. He opened the throttle. The aircraft surged forward. The airspeed needle shot past 400 miles per hour and kept climbing. At 25,000 feet, where the old Mustang gasped for air, the new one roared. The gauges told the story. 430 miles per hour, 70 faster than before. Harker laughed into his oxygen mask. He leveled out, looped the aircraft once, and realized he was flying the best machine he'd ever touched. The controls, smooth. The climb, effortless. The sound, pure power. When he landed, the ground crew crowded around the plane. Harker pulled off his goggles, grinning like a man who knew he'd just rewritten the rulebook. His flight report was short and legendary. The Merlin Mustang is the finest fighter aircraft I have ever flown. Performance exceeds the Spitfire Mark 9 above 20,000 feet, while maintaining double the range. In just one paragraph, Harker had ended years of debate. The impossible was now proven fact. The RAF tested the aircraft themselves and confirmed everything. Pilots came back with the same words. It's faster, it climbs better, it turns tighter, and it can go 3 times farther than a Spitfire. What began as an unauthorized test flight was now the talk of the entire British Air Ministry. But across the ocean, in the United States, the reaction was very different. The Americans had rejected this plane once. Now they were being told by the British, and by a mechanic, that they'd made a mistake. And that didn't sit well. A bureaucratic storm was about to begin, because the British had just proven that the best American fighter was built illegally. When reports of the Merlin Mustang reached the United States, the reaction was uncomfortable. For months, American test pilots and procurement officers had insisted the Mustang was a dead end. Now the British, and one mechanic, had proven them wrong. At Wright Field, engineers studied the British data in silence. Every number, every chart, every altitude test, all of it undeniable. But acknowledging it meant something few in the U.S. Army Air Forces wanted to admit. They had made a mistake. Official memos used polite language. The RAF's suggestion regarding the Merlin installation is noted. However, we are already committed to the P-47 and P-38 for escort duties. Behind the words was something simpler. Pride. The Americans had invested millions into other fighters. Switching now would mean rewriting the plan and admitting that the best American fighter came from a British engine. But even as the bureaucracy hesitated, events in Europe were spiraling out of control. The bombers were still dying, and the Allies were running out of time. By the summer of 1943, the air war had become unsustainable. Each raid into Germany meant hundreds of empty bunks at English air bases by nightfall. Bomber losses of 10% per mission weren't just tragic, they were catastrophic. At that rate, entire squadrons were being wiped out before completing a single tour. The generals knew the truth. Without a long-range escort, the daylight bombing campaign would collapse. General Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, read the British reports personally. He saw the numbers, range, altitude, speed, and knew they weren't exaggerations. The impossible fighter already existed. It was just waiting for permission to fly. On November 8, 1943, General Arnold issued a single directive to North American aviation. Convert 2 Mustangs to Merlin configuration immediately. Report results directly to my office. But the engineers at North American didn't need the order. They were already doing it. While the British were secretly modifying their Mustangs at Hucknall, North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, had been in quiet talks with Packard Motor Company, the American firm building Merlin engines under license. The timing was perfect. No more excuses about supply shortages or foreign parts. The Packard-built Merlin was American-made and ready. Within weeks, 2 prototypes rolled out of the hangar, designated NA-102 and NA-103. They would prove once and for all what Harker had risked his career to show. Test pilot Robert Chilton took the first into the sky on November 30, 1943. At 25,000 feet, the aircraft reached 440 miles per hour. It outclimbed the P-47, outran the P-38, and flew twice as far as both. The Mustang had been reborn, and this time America was watching. By December, General Arnold had seen enough. He ordered immediate full-scale production. Every available Mustang would be fitted with a Merlin engine. The Allison program was cancelled overnight. Factories in California and Texas roared to life. By spring 1944, hundreds of new Mustangs rolled out each month, sleek, powerful, and ready to fight. The fighter America had rejected was now the one that would win them the skies. December 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England, paint still fresh, engines gleaming. The fighter everyone had doubted was finally ready. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, a squadron soon nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group. At first, the pilots were skeptical. The Mustang looked small compared to the massive Thunderbolt. It had only 1 engine and 6.50 caliber guns instead of 8. But the first time they took it into combat, everything changed. December 5, 1943. Mission to Amiens, France. At 25,000 feet, the Mustangs climbed faster than the bombers they were escorting. They wove effortlessly above the formation, calm, controlled, confident. Then German fighters appeared. When the Mustangs dove to attack, the Luftwaffe pilots realized too late this wasn't the Thunderbolt they were used to. This was something new. Something faster. Lieutenant Charles Gunn destroyed 2 FW-190s on his first mission. His report was short. The P-51 does everything the P-47 does, but it stays with the bombers all the way home. By January 1944, entire fighter groups were transitioning to Mustangs, the 357th in February, the 4th in March, led by Captain Don Blakesley, the same man who had once begged for a fighter that could reach Berlin. Now he had it. Mission after mission, the P-51 proved unstoppable. Over the skies of Germany, its range, climb, and speed turned the air war upside down. Kill ratios soared. The Mustangs achieved 11 enemy kills for every 1 lost. The Thunderbolt averaged 7 to 1. The Lightning barely 5 to 1. German ace Günter Rau admitted, "The new American fighter is superior to our aircraft in almost every way." The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding to death in its own skies. With the Mustang in the air, daylight bombing became possible again. In early 1944, US bombers struck Berlin for the first time and came home. Losses that had once reached 10% per mission fell below 4%. For the first time, the bombers had a guardian from takeoff to target and back. General James Doolittle issued new orders. Destroy the German Air Force wherever you find it, in the air or on the ground. The Mustangs took it literally. They hunted fighters before they reached the bombers. then strafed airfields, convoys, and rail lines across Germany. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken, and when D-Day came that June, the skies over Normandy were almost empty of German aircraft. The fighter the experts rejected had just won air superiority over Europe. By spring 1944, the Mustang had become the backbone of Allied air power, but North American aviation wasn't done improving it. The P-51D arrived that March, sleeker, faster, deadlier. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, a new bubble canopy for 360-degree visibility, and a refined Merlin engine that could push nearly 450 miles per hour at altitude. Pilots loved it instantly. It was faster than a Spitfire, tougher than a Thunderbolt, and could fly to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and fly back on a single tank of fuel. The P-51D wasn't just a fighter, it was the fighter. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was on life support. The numbers told the story. In March, the 8th Air Force lost 131 bombers. In April, 70. By June, just 42. Every month, the Mustang's presence grew, and Germany's skies grew emptier. American aces racked up victories at a pace unseen in the war. Major George Preddy scored 26 kills, Colonel John Meyer 24, and a young pilot named Chuck Yeager used his Mustang to take down 5 German fighters in a single day. The Luftwaffe's own reports were grim. Avoid extended combat with P-51 aircraft. They are superior in all performance categories. When D-Day came in June 1944, Allied bombers flew above the beaches unchallenged. German fighters never broke through the Mustang shield. From that moment on, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. By 1945, the P-51 Mustang was everywhere. Over the Ruhr, over Berlin, over the collapsing Reich. They hunted German jets on takeoff, strafed supply lines, and shattered what remained of the Luftwaffe. In total, 15,575 Mustangs were built. They destroyed nearly 9,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter of the war, and only 16% of all Mustangs produced were lost in combat, an astonishing number in the brutal skies of Europe. When victory finally came, the sound of the Merlin engine was the sound of Allied air supremacy. The P-51 Mustang fought again in Korea, flew for air forces around the world, and even today more than 150 still soar at air shows, their engines echoing the triumph of innovation over bureaucracy. But its true legacy lives in the story of how it was born, from a rejected design, saved by a mechanic's defiance, and proven in a flight that was never supposed to happen. The P-51 Mustang, a fighter that should never have existed, but without it, victory might never have come.